This episode is one I've actually discussed before with a friend of mine many years ago. We were talking about B5 in general and storyline stuff, and I brought up this episode to him with regards to episodes that I didn't really like all that much, and at the same time I also liked. Kind of a weird situation, but you know, there it is. The reason I mention that, though, is because this episode is like if you took a typical Star Trek episode and a typical Babylon 5 episode and mashed them together very crudely. The A-plot and B-plot of this episode have nothing to do with each other whatsoever. They could each be so completely segregated as to be their own episodes in their own right. And of course, I've talked at length with my issues with the A-plot, B-plot format over on Voyager, and indeed here as well, so I don't really feel the need to completely reiterate that. But I bring it up because the B-plot here, excuse me, I'm saying that wrong, the A-plot, or no, I suddenly can't remember, I'm sorry, I'm really tired. The plot that involves the threat to the station is the plot involving Sheridan, in this case threat to a main crew member. And, you know, the alien and energy or gas being that's, you know, possessed him, but is actually not actually evil, it just wants to go home to some part of space that's in another dimension, and, you know, blah, 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 blah. It's all the kind of stuff that... There's nothing wrong with it, and this is why I bring up that conversation I had years ago. It's just something that I didn't really enjoy. Now, we discussed why that was. The why was the really interesting part. He postulated that it's because well, I'm sorry, let me rephrase it. Let's start with what I postulated. I postulated that it's because I was tired of that storytime line idea. I've seen that story a few dozen times in a few dozen other science fiction works. Books, movies, games, television. So seeing it again was just kind of like, I've seen this before. Now, he actually said, well, I don't think that's true, and he gave me another idea, which I actually like so much that I think this might actually be it. That I just simply tend to enjoy more the more political science fiction story than the more high-minded new alien race, you know, alien possession, threat to the station kind of a story. That it's a matter of preference rather than a matter of repetition. Although it is worth noting that repetition, even of something you like, will slowly degenerate it to something you don't. The analogy I love to use is if you eat Reese's every single day, you're going to get tired of them after a while, right? So I'm not sure which is true. But I got to be completely blunt. I have like nothing to talk about the B-plot of this episode. You know, there's it's a way to bring Babylon 4 to Sheridan's attention. That'll be relevant later. I don't think that's a spoiler to say that. Otherwise, they wouldn't have brought it up in this episode. So, you know, Babylon 4 will matter later. And the end, I guess? I mean, I literally have no other thoughts written down about it whatsoever. I do want to mention the B5 triangle. That'll actually be brought up later on as well in what I consider to be the worst Babylon 5 story. And, I guess... I'm trying to think how to phrase this, because it starts off as kind of a horror story, the B-plot, and then it kind of shifts from horror story into your typical science fiction mystery, and then, you know, new alien race, etc. And I really have nothing necessarily wrong with any of those. So I'm trying really hard to analyze why it seems irrelevant to me, and I think... Having rewatched it this time with full analysis mode on, I think I finally have an answer that might not be the answer for why I've never really liked the B-plot of this episode. You ready for this? It's irrelevant. If I wanted to watch The Twilight Zone, I would go watch The Twilight Zone. Now, let me explain what I mean by that. Twilight Zone is one of the extremely rare examples of a television show that was extremely anti-continuity, but still very good, at least some of the time. There's actually a Twilight Zone syndrome, but that's unrelated. And I mention that because several shows in general try to go with that anti-continuity feel. In fact, as I've mentioned before, the original Star Trek was really just supposed to be like the Twilight Zone. Same cast of actors, different continuity each episode. Just like Twilight Zone, you know, like I said, literally anti-continuity. So if I wanted to watch a show that was anti-continuity, I would go watch a show that's anti-continuity. If I want to watch what is effectively a short story in televised format, I can do that. You know, there's The Outer Limits as well, for another example, that kind of a thing. But I want to watch the contiguous story that has to do with the past, the present, and the future. I want to watch continuity of the show. That's one of the things that really appealed to me about Babylon 5. That and a good character focus, strong emphasis on character growth, and an engaging and fascinating setting that is constantly moving and evolving. All of those things are all in the A plot. The plot with Urza and that whole thing, that's just all over the place. But the B plot, the only relevance, as I already mentioned, of the B plot is that it brings Babylon 4 to Sheridan's attention. Otherwise, it doesn't really matter for anything ever. Past, present, or future. And I think that lack of relevance is what makes it disinteresting to me. And I know that sounds horrible, and the argument could be made that that's my fault. That there's nothing wrong with a story that is self-contained. And it's true, there is nothing wrong with it. But it is less interesting to me than a story that is contiguous. I have nothing else to share about that, so let's move on to the fact that this teaser is probably the worst Babylon 5 teaser I've ever seen. It starts off, and Londo and Veer are singing Centauri music. Now that's actually a nice bit right there. That is a good teaser, because it ties into where they're going with this episode. The whole nostalgia, the great times of old thing, which is one of the main themes of the A-plot of this episode. But then someone shows up and says, "You will, how appropriate that you will die singing," cut to black. That's a bad teaser. You know why? Because it's cheating. It's literally like, okay, I've used this example before. In Deep Space Nine, there's an episode where a gentleman says, "I'm dying," and then it cuts to black. And then immediately after it comes back from black, "You must understand, when I said I was dying, I just meant I don't have much time left." It's cheating. It's artificially trying to make the audience think that something big is happening, and then immediately turning around and saying, "Nah, we were just trying to get your attention." It's flat out cheating, and I hate it. TNG did that once as well, in Season 2, I want to say, where all of a sudden the teaser ends with Worf, like, fainting on the bridge, "Oh my god!" and has nothing to do with anything. It's totally irrelevant. And it's cheating. It's cheating to try and create artificial drama, and I hate that crap. That being said, I really like the way they portray Urza here. The actor was a little wooden in his portrayal, but the character was not. And Londo plays off of him beautifully. You could tell so much of Londo's character here. So one thing I found very interesting, obviously one of the big threads that's been true all the way back to the very, very first episode, the pilot, actually, of Babylon 5, was the great, glory days of the Centauri Republic. But this episode really hits the nail on the head, closer and more tightly focused than any other episode has. In this episode, we get specifics, we get details, we get multiple people praising the old days, and at the same time hating them. What does Londo talk about? He talks about his own personal crusades of glory and the dueling and all the things that used to happen that were great, and we get all of a sudden the very quiet impression that the greater crimes of the old Centauri Republic, back when it was a great conquering power, were being ignored by its citizenry because the citizenry was reaping the benefits of those conquests, of that bloodshed, of the massacring, I believe is the term Urza used. It's a nice touch, because it makes sense. People are more willing to, people who have full bellies and happy lives are more likely to ignore the government and what it's doing to make that happen for its people, aren't they? Furthermore, of course, there is the goggles problem, the rose-tinted goggles. But some people tend to think that there's just, anytime you look to the past, there's rose-tinted goggles. That's not actually how that works. There's a whole array of emotional complexities that enter into how and why you would think of things in the past better. In Londo's case, we hear in this episode how much better his life personally was. His individual, small scale, his immediate perceptions of life were better. And therefore, he perceived life as a whole, for the whole Centauri Republic, to be better. It's a nice touch. And then Veer makes a great quote about how, what is the point of making history if you're not going to learn from it? This is once again Veer showing that he's way smarter than he appears to be. This is also the first mention of Cartagia, or Cartagia. I always have problem pronouncing it, because I'm weird with A's. The new child emperor of the Centauri. We'll be talking about him later. So, Londo this is probably one of the first times that we see Londo really going to bat politically. It says a lot for how much Urza matters to him, how much significance he places on their old relationship, that he goes to Rifa, a man he knows to be extremely dangerous, a man he knows to be more than violently oppressive of the other forces back in Homeworld. And he does so from a position of strength. Pay attention to what Rifa says. I wish I could just play it word for word for you, copy wrong issues. But if you could, just like pause this, go watch that chunk of the episode if you can, and then come back to me, because what Rifa says is brilliantly designed. He sounds like he's saying, I'm on your side on this. I'll do everything I can to help you, and I will protect you, of course. But pay attention to what he says and how he says it, and you understand what he's actually saying is, no, I will not help you on this matter. You are wrong, and this is something that's not moving forward. He pretty much flat out shuts down Londo and rebuffs almost all of Londo's attempts at actually being the hardliner in this case. And that makes sense. Rifa is basically the, I'd say at least the head of his particular faction of the people who moved for the retaking of power. And this entire movement towards the glory of the Centauri at any means necessary. And Londo, of course, while he is extremely politically powerful, his reach is not infinite, especially since so much of that power is connected to Rifa and his group. So in the end, Londo accomplishes nothing, despite the fact that he was willing to put himself forward and actually put himself on the line politically for his old friend. That says a lot in many different ways. It's also interesting because Londo and Urza talk about what's happening to the Centauri. And they finally drop all pretense. And this is one of the extremely few times, we've seen it before, but this is one of the extremely few times Londo speaks honestly and openly. No politiques, no, I'm saying something without saying it. He just speaks bluntly and honestly because he's talking to his old friend who he respects tremendously. And he flat out says, old friend, we should be conquerors. We should be the people on the top of the heap. We should be building empires. That is our fate and our destiny. But he doesn't say that like you'd think. He doesn't say, this is our fate and our destiny. This is our power, our great... That's what Rifa's saying. Rifa's the one who has always been the one preaching and screaming. Londo is the one who says it with almost quiet resignation. And his line at the end as he talks to Veer, I'm already on this path. The blood is already on my hands. This is where things are going. I will now see it to its end. There's a tone of quiet, melancholy resignation. Keep that in the back of your mind. That will play in the future. But then Urza rebuffs him and says, no, I will not build an empire off of slaughter. We should not build an empire off of all these horrible things. He mentions, they keep talking, they've mentioned like 4 or 5 times in the episode, hey, he's the great hero of, I forget the name of the place. And then he says, after that place, I stopped being a great hero. I stepped away from this policy. And he doesn't say it flat out, but he implies through all that he says, that was when I realized just how horrible of a people we'd become. And when he started moving to try and reform the Republic. And that, of course, is why he has now been disgraced politically. And that will lead to the disgrace of his entire family. And that leads to the most horrible part of all, when he challenges Londo to the duel. Both Urza and Londo clearly, by the way they act and what they say, understand what that duel means the moment the challenge is met. In fact, I would say before so as well. And Londo clarifies and confirms this by the end. He says, the whole point of the duel, he could have killed me at any time. He just had to make it look real. The whole point of the duel was he wanted me to kill him to save his family. He sacrificed himself to save his family because of the way the law works. They are now part of House Malari, and they are now protected and safeguarded. And Londo himself gave his word to Urza, I will take care of them. Urza, the military tactician who abhorred war and no longer wanted to be a conqueror, handed the reins of his family over to Londo, the politician who sought more conquest and war. The two perspectives are very different, but the mutual respect between the two means that Urza knew Londo would take care of his people. And Urza was more than willing to lay down his life to make that happen. Because Urza's a tactician, and he knows when he's lost. I got the very strong impression in this episode, and there's some good chemistry between the two actors, that Londo and Urza are as close to Nakama as he's probably ever had, and indeed will ever have. And I like that. Probably the one line that really sticks with me the most is Londo's, where he says, "Why did you make me do this?" Again, clearly indicating they knew exactly what they were getting into. This is yet another story that ends in tragedy when it comes to the Centauri Republic. It makes me wonder how many other Centauri think like Urza does. Think that this whole concept of being these butchers who ignore morality and ethics and legality and are willing to do whatever is necessary to build this horrific new empire of corpses, and think that that's the wrong thing to do. Or how many of them are like Rifa, who embrace it as if that's the proper path. I guess we'll find out in the future. But for now, all I can say is I'll see you next week.